his work has helped.
Hi, thanks. I'm happy to be here. So this is me. This is the name of my talk, and I just want to point out this is a well-known kids' book in the U.S., Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. I don't know if it's known here, but people would all recognize this headline. It's a lightning process trial, which many of you probably know about. A saga of terrible, horrible, no good, very bad research, and even worse editorial decisions. So why are the editorial decisions in general even worse? Well, you can do a horrible, stupid, awful, very bad, no good trial, but if nobody publishes it, like if no BMJ journal or the Lancet won't publish it, then it won't actually impact health in the same way and won't have a negative impact. It'll just be bad for the researchers' reputations, but it won't have an impact on everybody else. So, the decision to publish terrible research, I think, is more egregious in a way than the decision to do the bad research in the first place, or at least it's a decision that has more ultimate impact on people. So that's why I'm really holding, ultimately, the editors of BMJ, and ultimately Dr. Fiona Godley, the editorial director of BMJ, for this disaster. So this is the study we're talking about. It was published in Archives of Disease in Childhood, a well-known BMJ journal, in 3 years ago, last month. And Trial by Error, actually, which is the name of my series, it is 4 years ago. This week, on Monday, it'll be 4 years since I published the first of a three-part, three-day, why is the fatigue is wrong here? Okay. There's a TI missing there. I got to fix that. But anyway, that was 4 years ago, and I can't believe 4 years later, this was supposed to be a one-off. The study was supposed to be retracted after this, right away, because it was amazing to me that you could write 15,000 words about what a disaster the PACE trial was, and they could just not react. So I was very naive about what it took, and here I am 4 years later, working on saying the exact same things pretty much I was saying 4 years ago, but hopefully more people are listening. I just want to disclose that my funding right now is I crowdfund for this project. I don't get any money directly myself. Berkeley has a crowdfunding platform. So this was my crowdfunding in April. I raised $103,283. Probably fair to subtract $1,250, which came from other Tuller family members, so they probably shouldn't be counted in my kind of general total. So about $102,000 from non-Tuller people. I raised. Berkeley was sort of astounded by this. I've raised, the crowdfunding platform has been open for about 3 years. In my 2 campaigns, I've raised about 12% for all the projects at Berkeley over the last 2 years. So as far as I know, I am the only person in the US, possibly, with a crowdfunded academic position. I haven't heard of this before. Berkeley had to think a few minutes about whether this was kosher. They decided it was. It's no different really from having a $100,000 grant or gift. I'm just getting it in very small donations from people who support my work. Now, this has led to some issues. So my disclosure is that I have, quote, conflicts of interest, according to Professor Michael Sharp. Is he here, Michael? No, okay. But Michael, if someone from you is here, this is about you. Professor Michael Sharp says I have conflicts of interest, but I have to thank him because when I did my first one last year, he doesn't really realize that to tweet somebody's link to their crowdfunding is not a good idea if you're protesting their crowdfunding. This happened when I was in Australia, and the next day, or in the next few days, I got about a $10,000 jump in my donations, with many, many people tweeting to Michael Sharp saying, "Thank you, Professor Sharp, for reminding me to donate to David's wonderful campaign." So even though I have these conflicts of interest, supposedly, he helped me. And what I want to say about my conflicts of interest is that you can look on the page and see who donated to me and what. I mean, basically, my conflicts of interest are open. I've been claimed that I have been paid to trash the PACE trial. My response to that is twofold. One, I was trashing the PACE trial long before I ever asked anybody for any money at all. So I was doing it for free, and I was happy to do it for free. And the only reason I crowdfunded was because my funding ran out, other positions, and this was what I was invited to do by the Dean of Public Health, then Dean of Public Health at Berkeley, who invited me to crowdfund on Berkeley's platform. My other concern is that Professor Sharp has his own undisclosed conflicts of interest. And I've made this point many times. It doesn't seem to matter to anybody in the UK medical and academic hierarchy, including the Lancet, which published the PACE trial. In the PACE trial protocol, they promised to follow the Declaration of Helsinki. This was a very well-known human rights document designed to protect subjects of human research. It's very, very clear about what you need to do to get informed consent. To get informed consent, you need to disclose any possible conflicts of interest. That's a very broad category. It doesn't say any conflicts of interest, it says any possible conflicts of interest. Given that the main PACE investigators have long-standing links to disability insurance companies as well as government agencies, but mainly disability insurance companies who they were advising that the treatments that they were testing in PACE worked to get people to get people better, and that they should not get paid benefits unless they went through these treatments. The consent forms do not include this, and when they were called on this, when I called them on this, their answer is, we disclose to the journals. This is a completely ridiculous answer, a total non sequitur. As I pointed out, the Declaration of Helsinki was not designed to protect Richard Horton, Fiona Godley, and other journal editors. It was designed to protect the people you are experimenting on. And if you sign up to follow a human rights protocol in your human rights document in your protocol, you can't just leave out the parts that you find inconvenient to disclose. So that's my response to Professor Sharp's claims. So my other disclosure is that some of you know, I'm in a conflictual relationship with the lead author of the lightning process study and with Bristol University. The lead author publicly accused me of libel at her inaugural lecture at Bristol, and she never responded to my request to document her libel charge, because you can't just say it's libel just because you don't like what someone's saying. That seems to be the attitude here towards libel, that if you don't like what the person's saying, you can call them libelous. I appealed to Bristol. Bristol never responded, never explained why I was accused of libel, never apologized for it, never documented anything. Instead, the Vice Chancellor's office sent multiple complaints to Berkeley about my behavior. I'm still a Berkeley academic. I'm still engaging in whatever behavior they seem not to like. And as I pointed out, we're in an academic dispute. This is not an episode of The Sopranos. There is no excuse for threatening my employment, for contacting my employer about my behavior. It is inexcusable. So I want to make a few points. These are general points, not just about me. Again, tough criticism is not libelous. Filing freedom of information requests and writing letters to officials about bad research, which I've done constantly, as some of you know, is not harassment. It's public advocacy. Tearing up papers in public, which seem to be somewhat known for, because I tore up the PACE trial at the Invest in ME conference. It's not libel or harassment. I consider it academic performance art. As I've pointed out before, there are legal remedies for libel and harassment. For whatever reason, the PACE authors and other people have chosen not to take advantage of these legal remedies at this point. If they have such a problem with my work, they should take advantage of the legal remedies available to them if they think they can do that. Since they haven't, I would assume they don't think that's feasible, or they've been told by lawyers that nothing I've done is actionable. I am allowed to express opinions about what I think might be research misconduct or might be editorial misconduct. I'm a professional. I have a doctoral degree in public health, so this is my professional opinion. I am allowed to say things even if people disagree with them. It is my right as an academic and as a journalist, and I refute anybody who would suggest otherwise. So in the course of this, I just want to make clear, if I accuse anybody of research or editorial misconduct, that's my opinion. I am not deputized by anybody to authoritatively make that decision. I'm expressing my opinion. It's kind of like someone else will have to make the final determination, but I can say that if I want. So I just want to say a few things about the peer review literature, because all we're talking about here is peer review. Does it work? Well, yes, but. And I think of it like what Churchill said about democracy, the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. We don't really have a better method right now, but obviously it is really, really flawed, and not just in this domain. So I'm not necessarily saying, other science is great, or I'm not even saying, everything in the Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, like they're so great. No, I'm just focused on this particular body of research And in this particular body of research, the flaws and the editorial decision-making, it's all really egregious. But again, it's not limited to this. John Ioannidis, who's a Stanford professor, has written a famous paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Retractions across the board are at record levels. There's a very good site, retractionwatch.com, which is like an investigative blog about retractions. And as we know, there's a lot of pressure to publish, which are financial, academic, and reputational. So people just need to keep publishing, and we have a real problem with the proliferation of so many journals. There's not enough peer reviewers who really will put the time into peer review, and the journals apparently, from what I can tell, in this domain are not doing their job. Can everybody understand me? Am I talking too fast? I tend to sort of talk very fast, no? Okay, and I apologize also, I'm really bad at technological things, from bad at graphics, so I have too much text, yeah?
Sorry, could you slow down a little bit? Because I've got ME brain and it's difficult to...
And now I'm hard of hearing too. What was it?
Could you slow down a bit?
Slow down a little bit. Okay, I will. So, okay, so that's the peer-reviewed literature. So just a few kind of definitional things. In this case, the lightning process had two trials. One was a feasibility trial followed by a full trial. So what is a feasibility trial? It's a weird kind of thing where you're doing kind of a pilot study to see if the trial itself is feasible. Normally, when you would do a feasibility trial is if you're not sure you can recruit people, you're not sure the outcomes are the right ones, you're not really sure about the design. So you do a pilot study. The normal thing to do, when you do that, it's not unreasonable. You do a small study before you want to invest a lot of money in a big trial. So you do a small trial, but then you're supposed to do a completely other trial. Okay? You do a completely separate trial. You don't take your feasibility trial and just decide after to turn it into the full trial, and then include all the same people, and at the same time change your trial. You can't do that. That is not good science. That's what happened in this case, as we'll see. So yeah, full trial is to test the information generated in the feasibility trial, and it's a completely separate trial. That's the way it should be. You can possibly extend it, but that all has to be pre-designated. You have to say in your initial protocol, we're going to do a feasibility phase, and then maybe we'll extend it, but we're keeping everything exactly the same. You may be able to do that with various statistical ways, but basically you should do a feasibility trial and then a separate trial. Am I doing better? Okay. So we're also going to talk about prospective registration. So until about 15 years ago, it was very haphazard. There were official trial registries, and you could register your trial. And when you do your trial registry, you're putting down there, it's sort of like a summary of your protocol in a way. You're putting down your outcome measures, your primary measures, secondary measures, and other data. And then why do we do that? The reason is because then when you publish the trial, you have to adhere to the things you said you were going to do. You publish the trial, and then you recruit people you register the trial, and then you recruit people, and then you say, here's all the things I was going to do, and then you do them. And a retrospective trial is when you do the trial, and then after the fact, you kind of go backwards and register it. And you've already done the trial or done part of the trial, but that's not really a good way, because then you can sort of, based on what you already got, you can sort of adjust your outcome measures and so on and so forth. Or if you don't register the trial, people don't know what you promised to do, so then you can just pick and choose afterwards whichever outcomes are best for you. So basically, prospective registration means the trial was registered in an official trial registry before the first patient was ever recruited. Retrospective registration is patients enrolled after the trial is, before. That should be before registration. So forget that after, that should be before. And those trials at this point in time are unpublishable or should be unpublishable. Because what happened about 15 years ago is that all the medical journals, major medical journals, so the ICMJE is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. They all agreed that they would not consider or that they would not publish any trials in which the first patient was enrolled before the trial was registered. They will only publish trials in which the first patient was registered I'm sorry, when the first patient was recruited after the trial was registered. So you have to register your trial and then recruit everybody after. Every single journal, including BMJ, all the BMJ journals, agreed that they would not consider for publication any trial at all in which patients were recruited before the trial was registered. That is not like a squishy requirement. It's a very clear requirement. Most research should know this. If they don't know it, then at this point in time, 15 years later, then there's something wrong with their education. So it's hard to understand that experienced journalists would not understand this rule. And editors all know this rule, so it's not an obscure rule. Fiona Godley, who's the BMJ editorial director, who I believe has engaged in editorial misconduct in the conduct of this and publication, or really the republication of this study. She testified about BMJ's zero tolerance policy in her testimony in 2013 to Parliament's Science and Technology Committee. And she boasted about this, and she said, as far as we are aware, in the last 2 years, we have not published any trial that has not been prospectively registered. Now, obviously today, she could not make that statement because they republished the lightning process study after knowing that it was not prospectively registered. A 2015 editorial in the BMJ called the prospective registration policy, quote, the single most valuable tool we have to ensure unbiased reporting of research studies. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about this slide, but one of the issues we have with this illness is that we really don't know what it is. We have multiple case definitions. The better ones include post-exertional malaise as a required one. Some of those are not even still very good. The 2003 and the 2011 international consensus criteria both do include it. Many patients prefer the international consensus criteria because it's specifically an ME definition. The 2003 Canadian consensus one is MECFS. But anyway, we have an issue because we don't really know exactly how to define the disease, and that makes it hard sometimes to come up with the right cohorts. But more specific often is better, and definitely it should include post-exertional malaise or whatever term is being used for that concept as a required symptom. So just a few thoughts about the lightning process. As you know, I'd never heard of this until I saw this study because it's not something in the US that anybody talks about. I gather it's more well known here, but basically it's sort of a goulash of, very what I call woo-woo stuff. Neurolinguistic programming, hypnotherapy, life coaching, positive affirmations, and so on and so forth. So it's some sort of, stew of all these things mixed together. And one of the issues is that, if you study something without any real biological plausibility or any understood biological mechanisms, you really need, as Brian Hughes, who's the Irish psychologist who's criticized the PACE study, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If the lightning process actually works, it does require probably some rethinking of how we think about mind-body interactions. So you actually need to have you always need to have very, very solid research, but especially if you're claiming that, telepathy or ESP or things like that are working, and people's minds are changing, curing them of physical illnesses, and you really need to have, totally unimpeachable research. That obviously isn't the case here. The other thing is about, it's fine. I'm not opposed to studying these things, and I'm also not opposed to adults paying, £1,000 for, go sit for 3 days and 5 hours and be lectured at or do exercises, whatever the lightning process involves. However, that's an adult choice to do, and that's an adult choice to spend your money. And we have a sort of understanding that when new interventions are tested, that it's normally considered most ethical to test them first in adults. And then, if they work in adults, then you might test them in kids. It's very unusual, from my perspective, to just go directly to a study of children, especially for a controversial kind of thing like this, where you really have no idea what's going on. So I'm just going to say some key flaws of the lightning process study. which are the ones I'll focus on. There are many, many flaws with this study, so I'm not focusing on everything about the study, but these are some key things that, just from a methodological perspective, make it completely invalid, ridiculous, and from my perspective, a probably good candidate to be investigated for research misconduct. The investigators recruited 56 out of 100 participants before the trial was officially registered. Now, they did have so they started the feasibility study, is basically what that was. They did a feasibility study, and they recruited 56 people. Then they registered the trial. When they registered the trial, they swapped their primary and secondary outcomes from the feasibility study after gathering the data from this 56 out of 100, which is 56% of their sample. Because after they registered the full trial, they collected 44 more patients, so that was a minority of those who were in the trial. The most extraordinary thing is that the investigators failed to disclose these things in the paper itself. The paper, when you read it, is written as if it was 100% prospective. So in other words, they make it seem like they registered the trial, recruited everybody, and that all the outcomes were pre-designated. That, in fact, is not the case. Had they actually disclosed the truth of what they did in the trial, archives would have had to reject the trial because it was not prospectively registered. So there's no dispute about any of these claims. So I want to talk a little bit about, not really talk about, because it's not worth talking about, but Phil Parker started the lightning process study. He was an osteopath, and who is he? This is a bio of his from a website of the European College of Holistic Medicine healing course. Anybody take this course with Phil? I guess not. So Phil Parker is already known to many as an inspirational teacher, therapist, healer, and author. He discovered that his clients' bodies would suddenly tell him important bits of information about them and their past, which to his surprise turned out to be factually correct. I'm trying to emphasize the exclamation point there. He further developed this ability to step into other people's bodies over the years to assist them in their healing with amazing results. It sounds kind of cool. So some of the skills that you might have learned in this course that Phil Parker taught before he developed, or maybe as he was developing the lightning process itself, he has the ability to prepare a space so that any energy polluting the room will not interfere with the work you were doing. I'm assuming that was done in this room before. Anybody take that on? You also learn about the use of divination medicine cards and tarot to make predictions. And he says, from a healing perspective, divination is useful in creating a strong connection with healing spirit guides. Okay. And then you can make predictions based on the spinning of a pendulum, which I guess is called dowsing. Using a pendulum in healing can focus your attention on the area of a client's body that needs healing, as its usage relies on energy and changes energy fields. Okay, that's Phil Parker. So what is the lightning process? I was trying to put a video in here, but I'm not really technologically adept at doing that. But basically, these are the kinds of questions that one might ask. This is from the lightning process site. Are you constantly feeling exhausted? No matter how much rest you get? Oh, that's the chronic fatigue syndrome people, I guess. Are you stuck with recurring health symptoms and issues? Do you find yourself worrying and feeling really stressed about things? Do you regularly feel low and upset? Etc. You've probably tried everything. Anyway, the lightning process could be the answer for you. So UK advertising regulars have sanctioned or disciplined or at least admonished some lightning process practitioners, because when you look at the ads for lightning process practitioners, they claim to cure pretty much everything. Multiple sclerosis, eating disorders, lots of other chronic illnesses, and so on, as well as, of course, chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME, or whatever it is they're choosing to call it. So basically, the UK advertising regulators have said, no, you cannot do this. Quote, advertisers should take care not to make implied claims about the health benefits of the 3-day course and must not refer to conditions for which medical supervision should be sought. In other words, what they're saying is that they can advertise this to sort of generally vaguely neurotic people and sort of unhappy, and it might be useful for people, to give them a boost of confidence. I mean, I have no idea. I don't have an objection to people going to do this. I do have an objection to people going to do this if they have multiple sclerosis and they're being told, this will cure your multiple sclerosis, or this will make your multiple sclerosis much better. That's not appropriate. Okay, but what is the lightning process? Well, here are their qualifications. The LP practitioners have completed a diploma through the Phil Parker Training Institute in Neurolinguistic Programming, Life Coaching, and Clinical Hypnotherapy. Following the diploma, LP practitioners undertake a further course to learn the tools and delivery required for the LP, after which they must pass both a practical and written examination. Well, I don't know about you, but that makes me feel much better about them. Okay, but what is it? So, one of the weird things is that participants aren't really supposed to share their experiences. This reminded me of when I took transcendental meditation when I was in high school, and we were all told our mantra was secret, and if we shared our mantra with anybody, it wouldn't work. When we did share our mantra, it turned out we all had the same mantra. So that advice seemed to me a little self-serving. In any event, in this case, people are basically, the whole idea is that if you change your thought patterns, it somehow biologically changes your systems and all your other, physiological aspects. Participants told not to share what happens in the course. We keep hearing about this. People stand and circle paper on the ground and they say, stop when they feel symptoms, or yes, to health, or other ways of sort of affirming your commitment to your health and not acknowledging that you're sick. Because if you acknowledge you're sick, it seems like you will keep on bringing sickness onto yourself. There have been a couple of patient surveys, and this was presented in the information about the study to participants, that the ME Association and Action for ME, I guess, Action for Young, AYME, Association for Young Children with ME, had surveys where many people said that this seemed to make them feel better, but in both cases there were significant percentages that said it made them worse, in some cases significantly worse, and many people said they had no response whatsoever. Anecdotally, we do hear about people improving. Of course, we don't necessarily know what their diagnosis was, even if they had a CFS diagnosis. We don't know exactly what that was. We also hear about initial improvements that wear off after the adrenaline rush, wears off after 3 months or 6 months, or people do a lot and then they have a bad crash. So I've heard those stories a lot. And then we hear about post-lightning process crashes, and then people being in despair, and then some suicide attempts, or in a couple of cases I've heard of people, anecdotal reports, so I haven't tracked these down, of suicides when patients feel they have failed to heal themselves, because the whole onus is putting it on you to be the person, if you can heal yourself if you want to, okay? So why did they do this study in children? Well, according to the investigators, they were being asked routinely about it by parents, that they said hundreds of children were doing it anyway a year, and so there was an urgent need. Hundreds of children diagnosed with CFS. Again, and I say CFS, I would say ME myself, but CFS is used for these children, so we don't know how they were being diagnosed. So please don't then email me and say, oh, it's not CFS, it's ME. I understand all the complications with the name. So I will be likely referring to it often here as CFS because that's how they're generally referring to it in this study. They were asked basically to do the study, the researchers said, by Association for Young Children with ME based on this urgent need because all these children were supposedly doing it. Or maybe they were. Of course, it's a commercial program, so the NHS was not going to fund it, but it was funded privately. Again, as I said, it's standard practice in something like this. You want to do a study in adults first, and then you do it in kids. You don't usually do it in kids first, no matter what the urgent need is. And the idea that you're not supposed to tell anybody anything, it really does raise ethical concerns when you're dealing with children, because that's sort of a way, that's what abusers tell their children. Abusers tell the children that they're abusing, this is a secret between us, don't tell anybody. And so it's just not a good thing to be telling children that they can't tell their parents, they aren't supposed to be telling people what this is. Now again, I wasn't in the thing, if that's what they're telling the children, but that's the understanding of what the Lightning Process program does. It's a 3-day program and you're not supposed to be sharing it with other people. And you're supposed to be sort of basically saying, yes, I'm better, because that's the whole program. You say you're better, and you're taught that that will make you better. Now, one of the interesting things is they had such trouble with recruitment. They really had a hard time getting enough recruits, which is probably why they ended up folding maybe why they ended up folding the feasibility study into the full trial. To me, this seems like a contradiction. If there were so many parents a year sending all their children to this, and there was such an urgent, desperate need for it, why do they have trouble getting so many people? I just don't understand how the two things make sense at the same time. As far as I know, that hasn't been explained. If you present an urgent need, you shouldn't have that much trouble, and there's so many people doing it every year, and you're providing it for free. Remember that. You're providing the service for free because the parents aren't paying for it. So why would you not be able to get enough parents to get their kids to the trial if so many are sending their kids to the lightning process in the first place? I'd like to know the answer to that. So there are some questions also about the consent information provided. In the press conference, the lead investigator, she wrote about, we heard about people getting better and people getting worse. I was kind of curious. So of course we have to test it in children. In the leaflet for children, when the part about any side effects, we do not think there are any side effects of the intervention. I don't really understand how this corresponds with that. If you hear about people getting worse, then obviously there might be some side effects of the intervention. So you have heard about some possible side effects of the intervention. There is a general comment about disadvantages. Teenagers with CFSME can get worse with any intervention offered. Okay, that's true. But that really doesn't address this specific thing about any side effects about this specific intervention, because you've already said that, or you've said later that you've heard about people getting worse. So why aren't you telling in the documentation that people are getting worse? Now, they might say, well, we did include the graphs of the, at the end, we included the graphs of the results from the survey. So anybody could look at that and they could see some people claim to get worse. Well, okay, that's not a satisfactory answer. Some people may not go to the end of the information. Some people, if they have ME, maybe they can't read numbers. Maybe it's hard for them to read the graphs. You really can't, and these are children. You need to be very explicit. If you have been told that people are getting worse, kids are getting worse, why aren't you including that specific information in your consent forms? That is not right. So here's the timetable. They started recruiting for the feasibility trial. Well, let me first say, this is after there had been a lot of concern, and so there was a lot of ethical challenges beforehand. Some of the questions that I raised here. Those were all rejected by the research ethics committees. And I will say that research ethics committees in this domain have also completely not done their jobs. As far as I can tell, mostly what they've done is rubber stamp bad research. So when the researchers appealed to, well, we got approval from our research ethics committee, well, that's not acceptable because they're making bad decisions. And really someone has to take responsibility for that. So anyway, they started recruitment for the feasibility trial. And they finished that in the summer. Then they registration of the full trial as prospective, which was false. In the same time, they had the full trial protocol, which as the registration did and the full trial protocol, they swapped their primary and secondary outcomes from the feasibility trial. And in summer of 12 till April 2013, they recruited for the full trial. And then they published the trial falsely as fully prospective with pre-designated outcomes. Nobody reading the trial would have any idea that 56% of the participants were recruited before the trial was registered, and that at that point, the primary and secondary outcomes were swapped. Okay? Nobody would know. This is the second part of the timeline. Some of the dates, because the trials showed that patients were recruited starting in September 2010, and that the protocol wasn't published until 2012. Patients on the Signs for ME form started wondering about these discrepancies. Yeah, forget that last D at the end, it's just a typo. So then I wrote a long blog about it in December 2017 after I then got the documentation and looked at it, and it made no sense. And I realized what had happened, as patients had already... I just want to say that most of my work is based on information or tips that I get from patients, including the stuff about the PACE trial. So I've really piggybacked, and I really want to make this clear, that the patients are the brilliant ones here. The patients who are analyzing these things are incredibly brilliant, and I've really piggybacked on their work. I couldn't have done what I've done without them, and I just want to make that clear every time I talk, because it's really important, because the patients have been dismissed as hysterical, crazy, anti-science, climate change denying people, and they're not. The climate change deniers are these authors, the PACE authors, and everybody else who is claiming that this nonsense is good science. I wrote, and in January 2018, Virology blog sent a letter signed by, I think, 21 experts saying that this is unacceptable. You have to actually look at this, saying that basically pointing out that the trial was not prospectively registered as claimed, and that the trial did not have designated outcomes as claimed, and that, in fact, the authors either forgot to mention this or they lied. I mean, I don't know, to say someone lies is a harsh thing because it means that they knew they were doing something wrong. I have no idea whether they lied, whether they knew it was wrong or whatever. I find a hard time to believe that they didn't know, but in any event, even if they did it unintentionally, they did it. In June 2018, Archives posts an editor's note in the journal, in the journal equivalent of Siberia. What do I mean by that? They published a note which basically acknowledged all the things I had said without being specific, and they said now it's under editorial, quote, consideration. They've gotten responses from the authors, and the whole thing's under editorial consideration. But if you looked at the trial, normally if a correction's posted, you go to the trial and it says correction. You know immediately what's correct is, and you go to the correction. Here you go to the trial, and you have no idea that anything was wrong. You have to go to a completely other page to find this editor's note. So basically, nobody saw it except me, and then once I posted about it, other people saw it. But it's invisible. It's really, it's absurd. I mean, it's like you correct a newspaper article and you put it on a completely other section of the paper or something like that. It makes no sense. As a result, in March 2019, a high-profile review of pediatric illness cited the LP as effective. Presumably they didn't see, or maybe they did see and they didn't care, but I assume they didn't see that it had this kind of egregious editor's note. Finally, in June 2019, Archives publishes a massive correction clarification, and then they republished the paper with the exact same findings as before, which I was totally shocked by. So let's look at the LP trial. It was 100 kids, 2 arms. One was the lightning process plus what they call specialist medical care, which basically means whatever you get when you go to a regular clinic, versus just standard specialist medical care. Okay, I've already said this. They recruited 56 for the feasibility trial, 44 for the full trial. They analyzed data from 81, which means they had, or full data from 81, which means they had a fair amount of dropout. That's a fairly high rate of people who didn't provide data for some of the outcomes. Like PACE and other studies from the CBT-GET fan club, the lightning process study is an unblinded study with self-reported outcomes. This kind of trial design, we don't use this trial design for any other for pharmaceuticals. Nobody would approve a pharmaceutical based on a study in which everybody knew what they were getting, everybody knew which was the placebo, and then at the end, all you asked them was, do you feel better? Or can you do more? That's just not how we regulate pharmaceuticals. So it's not completely clear to me why we should regulate anything else or prove anything else based on this kind of research, based on these kinds of studies. Because if you're told that something's going to make you better, and then the other group isn't told it will make you better, and then you ask in a few months, do you feel better? And especially if the intervention involves telling you constantly that you have to always say yes, yes to health and no to disease, and that if you don't do that, you're going to make yourself worse. It's not very surprising you might get some marginal increases in people saying, hey, I feel better. So this is their conclusion. The LP is effective when provided in addition to a specialist medical care for mild, moderately affected adolescents with CFSME. So that's what they said. So let's just look at the outcomes. And these are just a couple of the outcomes, but the main ones that we need to be concerned about here. So the primary outcome in the feasibility trial was school attendance at 6 months. So they promised in the feasibility trial that they would look at this in 2 ways. One would be self-report, so asking the kid or the parents, did the kid go to school in the last week, how many times, or how much did they miss? And then you go to the school and say, can we see the official records? Okay? So they promised this in the protocol. They also promised this in the feasibility trial protocol, so they promised this in both protocols. One of many secondary outcomes in the feasibility trial protocol was self-reported physical function, which is the SF-36 subscale, which was the same one used in the PACE trial. That's a scale of 0 to 100 where 100 is perfect health. Most normal people would score like 90, 85, 90, 95. And if you score 0, you're basically a corpse. And so that was the secondary outcome. But it's completely self-reported. When they published the full trial protocol and then the paper, the primary outcome as reported was now the self-reported physical function at 6 months. And the secondary outcome, the former primary outcome, school attendance, was at 6 months was, this should be at 6 months. School attendance at 6 months was the secondary outcome, as was school attendance at 12 months, okay? So that's important to note. Anyway, but they only did self-reported. They made no mention of these records that they had promised to provide. So this was just based on kids or parents saying whether the kids went to school. They had nothing objective. So the only objective measurement in this trial was this. And they abandoned it when they did the full trial. So the published results showed that there were modestly positive results for the SF-36 at 6 months. So that was, I think it was 12 points on the 100-point scale. So that's basically, seems like people responded positively to 2 of the 20 questions more. So there are 20 questions on that questionnaire, more or less. And so there was a marginal increase in those reports. And at school attendance at 6 months, there was no improvement at all. They also reported positive results for secondary outcomes, which they made a lot of fuss about: anxiety, depression, fatigue, and school attendance at 12 months. But to point out, school attendance at 12 months had positive results, but it was just self-report. And again, they forgot to mention any records, so we have no idea, in fact, if that positive result is actually a positive result, because a self-report school attendance sounds like it's an objective measure, but it's really a subjective measure like other subjective measures, because it's the person's memory. You know, there's a lot of memory bias in studies, and there's a lot of wanting to please the therapist bias if you have somebody that you're working with. So there's a sort of therapeutic allegiance bias. And there's also the bias of, again, being told that you're going to get better. So we really do want to know any improvements in school attendance. They need to be vetted by official school records, which they were not. Again, the outcome swapping was not disclosed in the paper, and it's very clear. Without the outcome swapping, the investigators would have had to report null results for their primary outcome, with very different conclusions. You could not report that the lightning process was effective. You'd have to report first, our primary measure showed no results. Then the secondary outcomes would say, but our secondary measures, we seem to have some indication of some positive results. So let's say they had done that. The press coverage would have, of course, been very different. The presentations at the press conference at the Science Media Center would have been very different. So at the Science Media Center, of course, which are big fans of anything related to biopsychosocial approaches to chronic fatigue syndrome, they had 3 people saying this was, a decent trial, including Professor Michael Sharp, who thought it was pretty good. And so basically, it got this kind of coverage. Helps, and improves, and all the papers had these kinds of stories with these headlines about how effective, not how effective, but that it was effective or that it was helpful. And I found this very interesting from the primary author. It was fascinating. I never expected that it would work. And then she says, if anything, she set up the trial in a way that would make it harder for it to be shown to work. I would suggest that if you swap your primary outcomes after you've collected data from more than half your subjects, and you choose the primary outcome, which apparently might have had better results, and you drop as primary outcome the one that you ended up having no results for, that I think it's really a little bit disingenuous to say that you never expected it would work. And it's quite disingenuous to say that you set it up in a way that would make it harder for it to be shown to work. If you wanted to make it harder for it to be shown to work, you would not have picked the outcome that made it better. Presumably. So I want to point out the editor's note. So basically, this is the editor's note. Basically, it acknowledges what happened without, and it said, which are we have received clarifications from the authors which are under editorial consideration. Now, this was June 2018. Between June 2018 and June 2019, I must have written about 20 posts about the lightning process. I sent many letters to the NICE committee, to other people, to journals complaining, When the review was published saying that the lightning process was effective, I wrote to the review author, and what I do on these letters is that I CC everybody I can think of. That includes members of parliament like Carol Monaghan. It includes a guy who's an MP in the Bristol area who's also been very upset about this. I include members of the NICE committee reviewing all this stuff. So I reviewed and sometimes journalists that I can think of. So I really do CC these things widely. I can understand why the people involved really dislike this, but again, I don't consider this, I've been told that sending the letters is harassment. I don't consider it harassment. I consider it informing public officials of horrible research methodology about substantive issues which are being used for public policy. I did get one, after multiple messages to Fiona Godley, I did get one short, one paragraph message from her, which included this statement. X, our mutual contact, mentioned that you were concerned that the notice on the Archives of Disease in Childhood paper was not prominent enough. We are looking into whether this can be made more prominent. Our systems don't make this entirely easy. Okay, let's just parse this for a minute. It is hard for me to understand how BMJ doesn't have an IT department that can, within 2 clicks of the computer, move a link from one page to the main page of a study. For Dr. Godley to tell me that our systems don't make this entirely easy, I just don't understand it. I find it hard to understand, and I just felt like, are you kidding me? Get a new IT director. If you had a correction, you would find a very easy way to make it easy to put the correction there. I don't understand why you can't move the link. She also promised to keep me informed of other things, but of course I never heard back from her again. So, 1 year later of editorial, now let me point out, I got the documentation on this. It takes about 10 minutes to look over the documentation and verify that what I wrote was true, to verify the methodological and ethical violations involved in this study. 10 minutes, that's about it. Maybe half an hour if you're a little dyslexic and read slow. It certainly doesn't take a year, okay? There's no excuse for this taking a year. Meanwhile, parents are sending their children, presumably, to the lightning process based on the good housekeeping seal of BMJ and Bristol. So this correction, I've never quite seen anything like it. It's about 3,000 words, which I don't know how long the study was, but the study wasn't that much longer probably. Basically, it acknowledged all the concerns raised. The correction's amazing. And then they republished the study with the original findings. So I can say that when I dismay and revulsion among researchers who care about scientific integrity and understand editors' obligation to protect the medical literature. And my public health faculty colleagues at Berkeley wonder why BMJ and Dr. Ghali seem keen to damage their reputations and indifferent to protecting children's health. This is completely accurate. I go back to Berkeley, and every time something happens, my colleagues say, what? They did what? Nobody, or talk to Dr. Racanello, who hosts Virology blog at Columbia, and he's like, what? How could, everybody's tearing their hair out. And the PACE study is now used as a case example of horrible research in introductory epidemiology seminars at Berkeley, and I can guarantee you, I think the lightning process will soon be joining it in that company. It's just astonishing, really. So this is the republication, correction notice. Oh, interesting, the correction notice where it is? The IT department figured it out. I would, you could put, instead of this, you could have put editorial note, you could click to, but they couldn't figure, the IT department, Fiona Godley says, couldn't figure that out. Their systems are too complicated. So the editor's note was quite a comic thing. They had an editor's note accompanying the correction. So basically, yes, the final version includes acknowledgement from the authors that the study was not fully compliant. It wasn't compliant at all. Okay? It wasn't at all compliant with the requirement for trial registration that had been policy for 15 years. Okay? So this line, I couldn't believe. The process has additionally involved this is to show us what a great investigation they did. The process has additionally involved seeking assurance from the authors that the change in primary outcome was not influenced by positive findings. Oh, just positive in parentheses, just so we know that they were positive. In the feasibility phase. Okay, I don't even know what to say about this. The whole point of bias is that you don't know that you're biased, right? I mean, that's why we have If this was true, why even do studies at all? Why even have any blinding of anything? If all we need to do is rely on the authors to say, no, I wasn't blinded because all my findings were positive and the other ones were negative, okay, great, let's publish the study. It makes no sense whatsoever except as a form of protecting everybody's asses, okay? That's the only reason you could do this. It is totally unconscionable to base editorial decisions on this kind of statement. It is absurd. And when I can't even, obviously I'm dismayed by it, and I get increasingly agitated and upset, so I should probably stop mentioning it. But it makes no sense, because that's why we protect against bias. I mean, that's why we don't look at results before, because we can't protect ourselves against our own bias. That's the whole point of it. This was also funny. BMJ policy requires prospective registration of randomized trials, but we do not consider a failure to enforce that policy grounds for retraction. Okay, I don't get that. I mean, we wouldn't have published it had you told us the truth, but now that you didn't tell us the truth, we'll reward you by republishing it anyway, just because we don't want to be too harsh on you. This makes no sense. It is unconscionable editorial misconduct in my perspective, at an egregious level, at the highest levels of UK science. In my opinion. So after that, I organized an open letter to Dr. Godley about BMJ's ethically bankrupt actions. I got 55, what I quote, usual suspects. So these are my colleagues at Harvard and Columbia and Stanford and Berkeley and University College London and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and other places around the world. Many, many people who basically signed by 55 experts. These are key lines. Given BMJ's long-standing position that prospective registration is essential for safeguarding the integrity of the medical literature, it is unclear why you are now willing to exempt the lightning process study from this requirement. The swap, thus the outcome swap, thus ensured that the investigators were able to report positive rather than null results for their official primary outcome. And this is important. BMJ's actions are scientifically and ethically indefensible. They are also potentially harmful to the health and well-being of children. It is not easy, or it should not be easy, to get top experts to sign something to a major journal saying behavior scientifically and ethically indefensible. That is a very, very harsh statement to make. And to get top experts to sign that, anybody who's dealt with researchers, nobody wants to criticize other people's work. Scientists don't want to get involved in this kind of thing. They don't want to go out there criticizing work they're not involved in. They will only do it in the most egregious cases. That's very, very clear. This was a tough letter to Dr. Godley. After that, more than a dozen of the people who signed the letter sent their own individual letters to Dr. Godley, CCing all the other, basically when I sent the letter to Dr. Godley, I CC'd many of the signatories, and then they sent letters CCing all the other signatories. So this is sort of text heavy, but they're really tough letters. I mean, again, people do not send letters like this to top editors of major journals unless there's really, really a good reason, and unless the violations are really egregious. So in this case, Vincent Racaniello, who's my colleague at Columbia, whose blog, virology blog, I hijack a couple of days a week for my own purposes. As you are aware, many other scientists of repute have signed on to the original letter to you. I am sure we could have hundreds more. How many do you need before you are convinced that the work should be retracted? How much longer do you wish to risk harm to young patients? It's hard for me to imagine being an editor and receiving a letter like that and just ignoring it. Jonathan Edwards, a rheumatologist at University College London, who's been very active in this whole effort. I get the impression that bodies like Cochrane, which we're not going to talk about today, and the BMJ are sleepwalking into a situation where they rubber stamp commercial ventures of no merit. In this wider context, I can only emphasize the view of all those copied above, that the SMILE was the acronym for the lightning process study. The SMILE trial paper should be retracted and that a fully independent investigation should be completed as soon as possible. Ronald Tompkins at Harvard Medical School, I love this. I am appalled at this situation. As a doctor of more than 40 years and a scientist, it is my opinion that a retraction of this article is in order. And then Brian Hughes at the National University of Ireland, Galway. This paper would not have been published had you known about its irregularity at the time of initial review. Therefore, it should not be published now. Therefore, it should be retracted. Its existence will strongly encourage other researchers to play fast and loose with pre-registration, in the knowledge that their findings can still be published in a BMJ journal. You know, there's no arguing these things. It's incomprehensible, except as a way, again, of people protecting each other's reputations and protecting each other's asses, as I like to say. So, waiting for Godly speaks for itself. So, is the lightning process study a case of research misconduct? So this is from the Medical Research Council definition of research misconduct: misrepresentation of data, for example, suppression of relevant findings and or data, or knowingly, recklessly, or by gross negligence presenting a flawed interpretation of data. I think we can probably all agree, or at least maybe anywhere outside the precincts of Bristol and the BMJ offices can agree, that this was certainly a misrepresentation of data, certainly was suppression of data and information, or knowingly, recklessly, or by gross negligence, certainly presenting a false interpretation or a flawed interpretation of data. If you don't disclose that, you more than half the people were recruited before trial registration, and you don't disclose that you swapped the outcomes based on they say it wasn't based on those findings. To their credit, let me say this, which I didn't put in the slides. They had other reasons for why they swapped the outcomes. The reasons were related to students taking, I don't know the British system very well, but A levels, O levels, something that they weren't at school all the time, so it really wasn't an accurate one, that the participants themselves felt that, how they felt, or their self-report, physical function was a better measure than the school attendance. Maybe, maybe not. However, it's very coincident, coincidence or not, they picked the measure that gave them the better results as their primary outcome, okay? So I want to point out here that it doesn't have to be knowingly, it can be recklessly, even if it was unintentional, even if they didn't lie. Let's say they didn't lie, but they honestly made this mistake. It's certainly reckless in the context of scientific inquiry, and it's certainly gross negligence to leave those things out of your study, however you cut it. Whether you did it intentionally or not, it is seriously gross negligence. Again, this is the NIH, which isn't really relevant, National Institutes of Health in the US, so it's not relevant here, but it's essentially the same requirement. Manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. Clearly, this research was not accurately represented in the research record in the original way that they wrote it up. So there's no particular reason why it shouldn't have been retracted. You know, again, to republish it with the exact same findings was just rewarding the bad behavior or the reckless or grossly negligent behavior conducted by the researchers. And in doing so, okay, I'm just about done. And in doing so, I just want to get one thing out of my bag. And in doing so, the editors themselves also engaged, I would say, in reckless conduct. So, is the lightning process trial republication a case of editorial misconduct? I want to make clear that I don't consider the publication to be a case of editorial misconduct, the initial publication, because it's a good argument that for making sure that reviewers and journals all read the supporting documentation, right? They should have read the trial protocol, they should have read the Research Ethics Committee things. If they didn't, they should have themselves figured out before they published it that this was not kosher, that they did not meet valid requirements for publication. They didn't, okay? Or they published it anyway. However, the republication of it was certainly invalid. And in the republication, what I consider the case of editorial misconduct. So, why do I say that? Dr. Godley is very smart, and I presume she must know, or she should know, that the study would not have been published had the researchers been honest. She should know, or must know, that it's invalid to republish the findings. And the decision, again, is completely unacceptable. And so it seems to me that in all this saga, children's health and concern about children's health and the concerns of desperate parents wanting to do the best for their children have been completely overlooked for reasons that we don't know. But it seems to be, presumably, concern about reputational damage, concern that just retracting it would cause more reputational harm, perhaps. I mean, again, I don't know, I'm speculating, because I have no idea what the motivations of these people are. the only one that seems to make sense is protecting everybody against reputational damage. So that's basically, I want to thank basically all the patients who basically first, hold on, one thing I want to get out of my bag. Oh, here it is, okay. So I want to thank the patients and the people who, basically, as I said, I've really relied on patients to do this. Oh, I meant to take my shirt off. I have my Paceman t-shirt. So this was, this was made for me by my friend my very ill friend who's been sick for a while. I know Van der Zee, and when I went to talk in Amsterdam a few years ago. Usually I don't travel with it because I lose everything and I'm terrified of losing it, but I decided since I was talking near one of the origins of the PACE trial, I should wear it here. Professor Racaniello, who's my friend and colleague at Columbia, and basically when I started this project, and I sent him this 15,000 word, investigation at PACE, he read it and said, looks good to me, and published it. And, there was, he just trusted my reporting, and we could have both been sued up to here if I'd been wrong. But he trusted me. Professor Ronald Davis of Stanford, Jonathan Edwards of UCL, Leonard Jason of DePaul University, Bruce Levin of Columbia, and Arthur Reingold, my department head at Berkeley, they were the first one, they were the ones I got that really made my PACE investigation pop because they were the ones who provided me with outside, expert critiques about how horrible the trial was. And Bruce Levin would give me one of my favorite quotes. He said the PACE trial was the height of clinical trial amateurism, he called it. Which, for scientists to say that about other research is really, really, really extreme. I'm not extreme, I mean powerful. And so they were willing to put their names out there criticizing other science early on. I really appreciate that. Berkeley, as I said, has received multiple complaints. I'm still here. And I really appreciate that because I'm not a tenured faculty. I'm outside faculty with a position at Berkeley. So I really have no legal protection as a tenured anything. But Berkeley believes in academic freedom and has stood by that. And they don't really, my behavior is my behavior. They care about whether I'm making accurate criticisms and valid criticisms. My faculty colleagues at the School of Public Health and at Berkeley elsewhere who recognize bullshit, and everybody who signed my open letters. And now, for the finale, I'm going to perform my signature act. Lightning process. Only one-sided publication, so it's bad for ecology, but there's more papers to tear up. That's it. Thank you.